A remote and forested coal mining town harboring the restless spirits of its long-dead miners, a deserted amusement park whose ruined attractions continue to entertain ghostly patrons from beyond the grave, and a forgotten New York City subway line that may just take you on a one-way trip to hell itself. Await on this journey through some of the most haunted abandoned places in the US. Let's jump right in. Hey guys, thanks for joining me on this adventure through some of the United States' most haunted abandoned places. Recognized for its diverse history, positively ancient ruins, breathtaking natural landmarks, weathered industrial constructs pertaining to the forming of the country itself, and more, the US is also tied to a range of chilling ghost stories, old hill folklore, and terrifying legends as old as the land itself. Are you sure you're ready for the horrors that might very well lie just beyond your own backyard? Our first haunt has us traveling down south to the Big Easy and through the chillingly deserted Six Flags New Orleans. Six Flags New Orleans, which is located where else but in the city of its namesake, in Louisiana, is an abandoned amusement park that was only in operation for a few years before its closure in 2005, and its overgrown bounds have since become a popular stop for dark tourists, YouTubers, influencers, and, more recently, amongst paranormal investigators for its alleged assortment of ghostly thrill seekers that still linger across its dormant grounds. Historically, establishment of a theme park on site would start back in the early 1990s, when Tom and Diane Winninger first proposed the potential attraction to the public, and also organized a partnership. And later, in 1995, developers would solicit a loan from the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development for no less than $15 million. Incidentally, the firm of Burroughs and Chapin, who were based out of Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, would in 1997 withdraw from this partnership, leaving the Ogden Corporation to pick up the reins. And this latter entity, through March of the year 2000, would actually end up selling off its theme park division for a jaw-dropping $148 million. Later the same year, through May of 2000, the park would open its gates as Jazzland, and the crowd that gathered on its opening night was estimated at just under 25,000 attendees, with around 75 to 80,000 season passes sold right off the bat. Notably, through its early years, the site was operated under Alpha Smart Parks, a Greek holding company that purchased the aforementioned Ogden Corporation's theme park division, and the attraction's various themed areas originally included Mardi Gras, Pontchartrain Beach, Cajun Country, the Jazz Plaza, the Kids Carnival, and the Good Time Gardens, alongside a host of rides including the Wooden and Steel Mega Zeph, the all-steel Rex's Rail Runner, the Zydeco Scream, a log flume called the Cypress Plunge, a splashwater ride called the Spillway Splashout, and an array of standard spinning rides complete with a carousel. Sadly, however, while their first year wasn't all that bad, 2001 would see the park in a deficit. Through the year, HUD would actually have to loan the company an additional $25.3 million to stay afloat. And in 2002, Alpha would file for bankruptcy, resulting in fiscal responsibility for the park falling on the city's shoulders. Now, this is where Six Flags would step in. Through March of 2002, Six Flags would purchase the property for $22 million. And although its name wouldn't change immediately, the New Orleans City Council would approve the massive corporation for a 75-year lease, under the negotiated stipulation that they repay the remaining $24.4 million owed by the city. Later, in 2003, Six Flags New Orleans was officially established, with the Six Flags Corporation throwing another $20 million at the park in order to upgrade it prior to its reopening in April. Notably, all of this money would go towards the addition of more shaded areas and new flat spinning rides. And with its reestablishment, it would also welcome a new theme featuring Six Flags' It's Playtime mantra, complete with that weird dancing old man that most of us 90s kids remember from those iconic and somewhat obnoxious commercials. Following its remodel, Six Flags would also add two major coasters to the site, being the Batman and the Jester. And as of 2004 to 2005, they would plan for the installation of a full water park. But unbeknownst to them, things were about to change drastically. With the now infamous Hurricane Katrina on the horizon, the park's last day of operation would fall on August 21st of 2005, just 8 days before the storm struck. Sadly, because the expanse was located in low-lying swamplands right off of Lake Pontchartrain, the hurricane would result in the whole of the site being flooded for days on end. And following rounds of inspections and prospective revitalization projects, in 2007, Six Flags would announce that they were chalking the venture up as a total loss. While several attempts at restoring the park were made over the years, all would be met in failure. And as of August of this very year, being 2024, a plan to completely demolish the site and redevelop it in its entirety has been approved and is in the works. While it may seem odd that a park which was only open for such a short amount of time harbors any hauntings whatsoever, conversely, Six Flags New Orleans is actually considered one of the most haunted amusement parks on the planet, and local legend tells the ghosts held within are a result of the countless victims of Hurricane Katrina, just trying to enjoy their time in the afterlife. Those who have braved the park, especially after nightfall, have reported the constant feelings of being watched or followed by someone or something unseen, disembodied voices, laughter, or even screaming heard on the winds, and shadowy silhouettes believed to be the spirits of those who perished in the storm, that usually travel in large crowds or clusters, and that namely manifest during heavy fogs. Some have described observing lights within the long dormant windows of various structures, or of motion detected in old overgrown stalls, while several more incredulous stories detail times the weathered park has seemingly sprung back to life, with electricity once again coursing through its veins, its attractions fully lit up, and its should-be non-functional coasters roaring overhead, with their cars seemingly packed to capacity with mysterious figures unknown. Finally, in more recent years, Six Flags New Orleans has become a hotspot for social media influencers, urbexers, and self-professed paranormal investigators, and a handful of said investigations have yielded high EMF levels, crystal clear EVPs, and orbs or even full silhouettes captured in photography and video, while others who have sneaked in Ouija boards have seemingly held full conversations with parkgoers that lurk just beyond the veil of the living and dead. And on to number 2, which has us braving the wilds of the last frontier and exploring the remains of the boomtown of Kennecott. Kennecott, which is located in the Copper River Census area in Alaska, is an abandoned mining camp that actually acted as the center of activity for several major copper operations through the area, whose ruins are now a popular stop for historians, tourists, and paranormal researchers alike, and its bounds are shrouded in a number of ghost stories and tales of otherworldly activity. Historically, through the summer of 1900, two prospectors with the famous McClellan Party, being Tarantula Jack Smith and Clarence L. Warner, would spot a green patch far above their encampment that, in their opinions, was much too high in elevation to host grass meadows. And upon exploring the patch, they found it to be malachite with chalcocite, or copper glance spilling off of the Bonanza claim. Incidentally, engineer Stephen Birch, who was fresh out of college and whom boasted financial backing from the prominent Havemeyer family, would spend the winter of 1901 through 1902 acquiring the McClellan Group's various interests in the name of the Alaska Copper Company of Birch, Havemeyer, Ralph, and Schultz, after which he would spend time around the strike sampling and mapping the terrain, and would find that the particular copper produced across the region was actually the richest concentration not just in Alaska, but in the world. Subsequently, in 1906, Birch would enter into an amalgamation with Daniel Guggenheim and J.P. Morgan and Company, who were doing business under a corporation known as the Alaska Syndicate. Eventually, the group would secure $30 million for the construction of a railway, steamship lines, and mines, and later the same year, the syndicate would purchase nearly 40% of the Bonanza mine, after which, in 1915, they would trade various assets in order to acquire a new public company called the Kennecott Copper Corporation. The following year, in 1916, Kennecott would oversee its most profitable era, with the mines producing around $32 million in ore, and over the subsequent decade, the syndicate would far outproduce initial capital spent industrializing the locale. In 1925, Kennecott geologists would predict a soon-to-be end to the production of the high-grade ore. By the early 1930s, a majority of the land's top-tier metal was depleted, resulting in Kennecott's various mines closing down one by one, and by the time the town site was abandoned, being circa 1938 or so, it had produced somewhere around $200 million in profit. Later the same year, journalist and politician Ernest Gruning would recommend that Kennecott be preserved as a national park. In 1940, President Franklin D. Roosevelt would pass over an opportunity to establish the Kennecott National Monument. In 1978, the whole of the site was added to the National Register of Historic Places. And in 1980, the Wrangell St. Elias National Park and Preserve was officially established. Through the following decades, Kennecott would become a popular tourist destination for those seeking to explore the old mine sites firsthand. In 1986, the site was declared a National Historic Landmark, and in 1998, the National Park Service would acquire a bulk of the lands that comprise Kennecott. In the present, the expanse offers a mess of attractions, including glacier hiking, ice climbing, and touring of its abandoned structures, alongside treks that take groups out into its various mines, being the Bonanza, Jumbo, and Erie. However, it is worth noting for any of my viewers considering an adventure that direction that some of these hikes are downright treacherous, and it's highly recommended that those wishing to explore the outlying abandoned mining operations make use of one of the many available local guides who can guarantee their clientele's safety. But natural dangers aren't the only thing to fear across Kennecott, and chillingly, a host of ghostly activity has been reported from those who have braved the abandoned old town, with stories of doors opening and slamming shut on their own, of the constant sense that someone or something is always watching, and tales of the screams of long-dead miners heard emanating from the main mill building. Disturbingly, some claim the area and its various structures are held together from the pure spite of those who toiled their lives away on site, only for their bosses to get richer, while they were eventually left out of a job. And it's classic Alaskan folklore, or even knowledge that, while several redevelopment projects have been proposed or even launched, attempts made by numerous interested parties and even by the state government have all been foiled by repeated harassment from the landscape's terrifying array of ghostly inhabitants, as if the spirits themselves aim to discourage its resettlement. Additionally, work crews have reported tools going missing or electronics behaving erratically, instances of ladders being toppled along with other dangerous occurrences that feel like setups for violent accidents, and even accounts of parties being chased by threatening, shadowy manifestations. Another local haunted hotspot is that of the old copper railroad and its paralleling dirt path. From the time the town was still active and up into the present, those traveling the route have reported a gathering of tombstones that appears suddenly where there shouldn't be any, and old-timey documentation tell of railroad workers scared out of their wits after purportedly hearing the wails of phantom children and adults all along the route that would, at times, become so intense it would make their work nearly unbearable. And it's not just Kennecott itself that totes terrifying activity, as some tell the surrounding wilderness itself is either cursed or damned, and those who frequent it have told of ghoulish creatures that slink through the underbrush, of run-ins with large furry beasts that have even attacked hiking parties, and of the glow of ghostly mining lanterns spied amongst the trees after dark that always disappear into thin air when approached. Number 3 takes us to the heart of the mountain state and through the abandoned company coal mining town of Thurmond. Thurmond, which is placed in Fayette County, West Virginia, is the remains of a late 19th and early 20th century company coal mining town that's bound to become rather popular amongst dark tourists, history buffs, and, more recently, with paranormal investigators due to the expanse's association to some of the state's most chilling classic ghost stories, and legends claiming the spirits of its former residents might still lurk within its old, decrepit structures. Historically, sparse homesteads would begin popping up through the Thurmond area circa the early to mid-1800s. In 1844, one Captain W.D. Thurmond, who served the Confederacy later in the Civil War, would settle down locally, and in 1873, as payment for a surveying job he completed, the captain was awarded 73 acres of surrounding lands. Later, in 1888, the Thurmond Post Office was established. In 1892, and following the completion of a crossing at the nearby Dunlop Creek, Thurmond's population and popularity would begin to grow, and in 1900, the town would be officially incorporated. Now, paralleling the growth of Thurmond, in 1873, railroad tracks would be laid next to the nearby New River Gorge, enabling settlement in regions previously chalked up as West Virginian wildlands. This new railroad would enable growth of various mine sites, and West Virginia's now infamous coal fields would begin sprouting up through the area. Incidentally, miners working these fields would begin settling into various surrounding towns and communities, and one such town, you guessed it, was Thurmond. While this next part is common knowledge to most Americans, as honestly it's featured in countless books, movies, songs, legends, and more, life working the coal mines was exceedingly grueling, and horrible conditions often resulted in tensions or even outright wars between miners and their bosses. To make matters worse for those settling in Thurmond, the captain actually banned the sale and use of alcohol throughout his community, and this resulted in men who would usually visit a bar to blow off steam, finding other ways to entertain themselves after work. In 1901, and just outside of incorporated lands, the Dunglen Hotel was established, alongside another lodging being the Lafayette, or as locals called it, the Lay Flat. Not surprisingly, to the south of the Dunglen, a red light district would form, and both miners and locals looking to escape the sobriety of Thurmond would often make the short journey required in order to spend their hard-earned paychecks on a little female companionship. In 1910, Captain Thurmond would pass on at the age of 90. The Dunglen Hotel would remain in operation for a good while until in 1930 it burned to the ground in a fire, after which, only a year later, in 1931, the Thurmond National Bank, which had been founded under the captain, would close its doors, while the town's only alternate bank, being the New River Bank, would, in 1935, move to Oak Hill instead. Through the 1950s, the community would be hit especially hard in the shadow of the invention of diesel locomotives, which would travel much longer distances and, not needing to stop in Thurmond for coal or water refilling, would result in a steady decline in the town's economy. As its populace all moved elsewhere, through the 1980s, the National Park Service would begin purchasing up old homes and business structures that they promised to later transform into a living history museum. In 1995, Captain Thurmond's old post office would finally close its doors, and later the same year, the old C&O Passenger Railway Depot was renovated and now functions as a park visitor center. Now, while Thurmond is officially considered abandoned, into the present, several parties still remain on former town lands. In 2005, Thurmond was considered the least populous municipality in the state, with 6 of its remaining 7 residents running for elected office. And as of its 2020 census, its total population has decreased to 5. Today, Thurmond serves its purpose as a living history museum and offers its visitors a glimpse into what life was like in an early 20th century coal town. But according to old West Virginian folklore, that's not all Thurmond offers, as its bounds have long played host to a slew of chilling ghost stories. Several informal investigations of the expanse have yielded high EMF levels and both orbs and silhouettes captured in the backgrounds of photography and video, while social media influencers, YouTubers, and urbexers who have braved the site have later reported sightings of people in old-fashioned attire hurrying by that are there one moment and gone the next. One of the town's most haunted hotspots is that of its old train depot, which, during its active years, witnessed countless lives pass through it. Now, as it's told, the residual energy from its many passengers and employees long since deceased might still linger, and visitors have reported figures spied wandering the area after nightfall, instances of items or objects moving around on their own, and a phantom train whistle detected approaching when the tracks are completely empty. Additionally, several park rangers have even documented the finding of various doors that should be locked mysteriously wide open, as well as a couple of old faucets that keep turning on and off by themselves. Through the nearby forests, both hikers and campers have reported encounters with various cult-like figures who are sometimes clad in hooded robes, the finding of suspected ritual sites complete with animal carcasses or bones, and encounters with a host of West Virginia's very own cryptids, such as the fabled Mothman, the Flatwoods Monster, and the Wampus Cat, while the New River Gorge and its bridge are said to be roamed by the spirits of those who either died constructing the crossing or in various mining accidents. Incidentally, through the area, many have reported encounters with shadowy forms, the sighting of ghostly lanterns drifting through the woodlands, and the eerie sensations of being watched, of being followed, or even of being touched or brushed up against by someone or something unseen. Number 4 has us braving the heat of the hottest place on Earth to catch a glimpse of the desolate oasis that is Scotty's Castle. Scotty's Castle, or the Death Valley Ranch, which is located in Death Valley National Park in California, is a two-story Mission Revival and Spanish Colonial Revival-style villa placed in the Grapevine Mountains. Its abandoned bounds have since become a popular stop for sightseers, history enthusiasts, dark tourists, and paranormal investigators, and that, in more recent times, has become recognized for its ties to various state ghost stories and tales of paranormal activity experienced within. Historically, this castle's past all starts with early 20th century con man Walter Scott, who was more affectionately known as Death Valley Scotty. In 1922, Scott would convince Chicagoan millionaire Albert Mussey Johnson to invest in his own personal gold mine through the Death Valley region. True to his profession as a matchstick man, however, promises of a fortune in gold were all hot air, and while Johnson was initially angered by Scotty's deception, after spending time around the con man, he would begin to find his lifestyle intriguing, and the two would actually end up becoming close friends. Following several trips to Death Valley, the expanse would begin to grow on Johnson, who would start purchasing local lands. After a series of trips made to the area by Johnson and his wife, Bessie, slowly the millionaire's health would begin to improve, and eventually, Bessie would recommend the couple construct a villa locally as a vacation home. The Johnsons would then hire architect Martin de Dubove, engineer Matt Roy Thompson, and designer Charles Alexander McNeilage to start the project, which would last from 1922 to 1931. And by 1937, the tycoon would have acquired just over 1,500 acres through the region. Unfortunately, the Johnsons' original land survey was actually incorrect, and mid-construction, they discovered that the property they built their Death Valley Ranch upon wasn't actually their property at all, but was instead government lands miles down the canyon from the plot they purchased. While Johnson would utilize his wealth to resolve the issue, in 1929 the stock market would crash, resulting in a loss of a good portion of his wealth. While he would eventually finish the project, it took all he could offer to hang on to the palace, and he would be forced to rent out rooms in order to produce necessary income. Sadly, eventually Johnson's health would continue to decline. In 1943, Bessie would die in an automobile accident just to the south of the castle, and shortly after, in 1946, in hopes their cherished estate would be preserved, Albert would establish the Gospel Foundation in order both to oversee the property and also to attempt to sell the lands to the National Park Service to be utilized as a state historic site. In 1948, Albert would join Bessie in death, leaving his castle in the hands of the foundation, after which, in 1954, Death Valley Scotty would also pass on and was buried on a hilltop overlooking the construct that he was basically responsible for. Incidentally, in fulfilling the Johnsons' last wishes, in 1970, the National Park Service would purchase the villa from his foundation for $850,000, and over the years would both refurb and maintain the landmark, and in 1978, it was added to the National Register of Historic Places. In the present, Scotty's Castle remains open to the public and is highly popular amongst history buffs, offering in-person tours to over 100,000 individuals annually. Notably, the site still contains the Johnsons' original decor and furnishings, and its tour guides dress in traditional 1930s-style ranger outfits. Oh, and for the more adventurous among us, an underground mystery tour is also offered, which features a walk through the inner workings of the castle, along with a quarter-mile of tunnels that run by the property's power supply, an unfinished swimming pool, and much more. Interestingly enough, Scotty's Castle, while not as well known as some of its counterparts, is actually considered in league with some of the US's most haunted mansions, and is often held in high regard alongside the likes of other prominent paranormal hotspots such as the Winchester Mystery House, Thornwood Castle, and so on and so forth. Surprisingly, the castle's ghostly past stretches all the way back to before it was even constructed, when, during one of his visits with Scotty, and before he knew he was being conned, Albert Johnson was actually held up by banditos who were apparently also searching for the area's lost or legendary gold mine. Of course, these banditos weren't actually robbers, but instead, and much like everything else associated with this lost mine, were just part of the farce that's now Scotty's legacy. Incidentally, Walter Scott had actually hired a group of ne'er-do-wells to act as if they were ambushing Johnson in order to perpetuate his lies as more convincing, but unaware of what was apparently a pretty good bit of acting, Johnson's security, or possibly Johnson himself, ended up shooting one of the actors dead. Ever since that fateful day, it's told the spirit of this dead accomplice, still clad in cliché bandit's attire, has been sighted roaming the area with a grisly gunshot wound right in the center of his chest, and that some nights, one can actually hear the ghostly echo of the fateful shooting that took his life, often accompanied by a cry of pain somewhere off in the distance. A second castle ghost story revolves around Scotty himself. Now, as it's told, in life, Scotty would drag chains around the basement area to make it sound like people were working within his made-up gold mines. It's believed the conman's spirit, ever dedicated to his ruse, might still linger on site, and both guests and official tour guides often report hearing rattling chains and clinking noises from somewhere just out of view. Additionally, investigators across castle grounds have reported high EMF levels and very distinct orbs in photography and video, while others have told of doors opening and closing on their own, of lights that flicker or turn on and off inexplicably, and of objects, especially those within locked displays, discovered rearranged entirely. Lastly, while the whole thing started off as a con, it's recorded that Albert and Bessie Johnson would actually end up falling in love with their castle and the surrounding landscapes, and some tell their spirits remain within their cherished homestead. The couple's ghosts have been sighted all across the expanse, sometimes young, sometimes old, and sometimes separate, though more often together, lovingly embracing each other as they watch tour groups pass them by. Saving the spookiest for last, our fifth and final haunt has us traveling to the Big Apple, or rather, under it, in order to explore the abandoned City Hall subway station. City Hall Station, or the City Hall Loop Station, is a closed-down stop on the IRT Lexington Avenue line of the New York City subway that's placed right below NYC's City Hall Park, next to the New York City Hall itself, in the Civic Center neighborhood of Manhattan. That's bounds have grown in popularity amongst historians, locals, and dark tourists, as well as an infamy due to a purported string of hauntings and strong paranormal activity experienced within. Historically, planning for the New York City subway line was started sometime around 1864, with development of what would become the first subway starting later in 1894, following the passage of the Rapid Transit Act by state legislature, who called for a subway line from New York City Hall in Lower Manhattan to the Upper West Side, followed by two branches that would lead north through the Bronx. A formal plan for said line was completed by 1897, required legal processes were settled by 1899, and in 1900, the Rapid Transit Construction Company was contracted to begin the project. Subsequently, in 1901, the firm of Hines and Lafarge was hired to design the route's underground stations. Later the same year, trees in City Hall Park were removed in preparation for the installation of our City Hall station, and were followed closely by a series of excavations. And in 1902, the Interborough Rapid Transit Company was incorporated to run subway operations. By 1903, tile work of the sidewalks and the station staircase were finished. On New Year's Day of 1904, Mayor George B. McClellan Jr. and a group of prominent NYC citizens would travel from City Hall Station 6 miles to 125th Street using handcars. Through April of the same year, the first train to run on its own power traveled from 125th to City Hall. And finally, through October of the same year, the City Hall station was officially opened, and would quickly grow in popularity. Unfortunately, this popularity would actually ultimately negatively affect the station's business as, with its singular entrance, it faced severe overcrowding issues. In 1909, the New York Public Service Commission would propose lengthening platforms at stations along the IRT subway, and while they would go on to do so with most stations over the following years, the City Hall station would receive no upgrades. And in 1918, the Lexington Avenue line was altered, resulting in reduced use of the City Hall station. Later still, in 1938, a relocation of City Hall Station's entrance was proposed, and in 1940, city government would take over all IRT operations. Incidentally, City Hall Station's decline would begin shortly after other platforms were lengthened and new longer trains were developed. Notably, because of its curve, it would have been rather difficult to lengthen, and following updates to other stations, the site was just less and less used. Through the early 1940s, a majority of passengers would utilize the nearby Brooklyn Bridge station instead, which was actually only about 600 feet away from the City Hall stop. This, coupled with the fact that the city wanted to switch things up to 10-car trains, made renovations of the old site not economically viable or worthwhile, and the City Hall station's final day of use would land on December 31st of 1945, when its last train departed. Preceding its closure, in 1965, the City Hall station was considered as a prospective location for a transit museum. In 1976, the honor of holding the New York Transit Museum would be bestowed upon a renovated Court Street station instead. Over the years, the City Hall station would welcome a number of tours and events, and in 1979, the site was declared a city landmark, ensuring its ongoing preservation. Through the 1980s, Mayor Ed Koch would look at the City Hall station to possibly hold a restaurant as part of a complete refurb to the City Hall Park. However, these plans would eventually fall through. Starting in 1995, around $2 million were raised in an effort to re-establish the old site as a branch of the New York Transit Museum. And unfortunately, in 1998, these plans would also fall through, with funding utilized to restore the structural integrity of the weathered old stop instead. In 2004, the City Hall station was honored on the National Register of Historic Places. By the mid to late 2000s, the New York Transit Museum would begin offering tours of the expanse. And into the present, the Old Demesne remains a popular stop for locals, history buffs, and those seeking to take a deeper look into the past and heart of the city that never sleeps. And honestly, guys, after hearing about the purported supernatural happenings that have occurred within the City Hall station, I'm not sure that following a visit, I'd ever sleep again either. Phenomena within the old station isn't a new thing either, as during its construction, a handful of workers reported hearing phantom cries, a strange commotion from the darkness, and creepy chants carried out in some foreign language. Shockingly, it was later discovered that the station was actually constructed below the site of an ancient battle, and it's believed the resulting dead were buried, you guessed it, right where the station now sits. Incidentally, many tell that those braving the area can still hear the echoes from the conflict so long ago past, and several more disturbing stories tell of individuals who have witnessed a mess of shadowy figures that clash together for moments before fading off down the tunnel. Interestingly enough, while the station itself is closed down, the tracks through the City Hall stop still act as a looping point for the 6 train, and while it's definitely not allowed, a handful of braver and more curious riders have stayed on the 6 train long past its last stop, being the Brooklyn Bridge station, just to catch a glimpse of the abandoned portion of the tunnels. Chillingly, those who have looped through the City Hall station have reported terrifying instances in which they've gazed out from the train's windows to find the entire platform loaded with people in old-fashioned attire, and several others have described being frozen in fear as the 6 grinds to a halt unexpectedly to let said passengers on before the ghostly crowd begins deteriorating before their very eyes, resulting in them riding the train with living corpses or even skeletons. Lastly, while this is a more rare occurrence, possibly the most disturbing accounts from the City Hall station tell of instances in which riders on the 6 train shoot right past the old stop, and, in place of performing its normal loop, are instead transported on a downward tunnel that seemingly leads directly into the earth, to a crumbling realm where horrifying monsters lurk, just barely visible past the train's darkened windows, as if it's somehow traveled to hell itself. Notably, this horrifying experience actually lingers until riders begin to panic or close their eyes, after which they always find themselves back on the familiar line, feeling as if it was all just a bad dream. Thanks for joining me on this journey through some of the most haunted, abandoned places in the United States. If you enjoyed hearing my histories and ghost stories, don't forget to subscribe to my channel, throw this upload a like, and share me with anyone you feel could use a good scare. Stay spooky out there.